My small Showman's engine needs some repairs, part 4, preparing the flywheel for painting with a choice of colours, removing the oil tank and linkage to allow access to the right hand side check valve which is leaking. After unscrewing the check valve, I use my usual method to remove the paint. Here's the flywheel once I remove the paint from this. I've tapped out the centre brass boss, that's why there's a mark where it used to be. And now when I look at this flywheel, I do realise that it's not particularly well keyed for the paint, which is possibly why the previous coat of paint cracked over time. What I need is some power assistance. I've mounted the flywheel in the chuck of my Myford lathe, and here I'm using some fairly coarse emery cloth to not only remove some slight chatter marks around the edge of the flywheel, but to really scratch the surface to key the paint. Whenever I do any sanding in the lathe, I always use the two-handed method. My left hand is putting some positive pressure on my right hand, so should my right hand slip, it will be moved away from the chuck, not towards it. After the emery cloth, I used a piece of wet to dry sandpaper to clean up the edge, and here I'm completing the job using a piece of Scotch-Brite. This treatment should produce a really good key for the paint. It's now very important that I do not touch the front surface of this flywheel. I've very carefully masked around the edge without touching the front part. And this is a shot of the first coat of etching primer on the inside of the flywheel. Don't be confused, it is not a shot of the paint drying. This is after the paint was dry, and it's 24 hours later. I turned the flywheel over and sprayed some etching primer on the outside of the flywheel. I'm being very careful not to get any runs or sags, and the good thing is this paint is superb. When you first spray it, it looks a little bit lumpy, but after a while, as it dries, it settles down. And here is a gratuitous shot of the paint drying. One of 3 instances of this during this video. What a rare treat. And once again, this is a shot of the paint after it dried. I waited 24 hours before applying the first top coat. And here is the top coat being applied. This can of paint I'm using is a can of HMG LMS Crimson Lake paint. The problem with it is, to my eye, it is entirely the wrong colour. When I bought this paint, I phoned HMG Paints to complain and say, well, it's really nice paint, but it's not Crimson Lake. I don't know how it works with the large paint companies, but what happened was, I received some paint from Phoenix Precision Paints in lieu of this. And not only that, I was allowed to keep the other colour, which is great for an undercoat. Here's a can of HMG Crimson Lake. And once again, 24 hours later, I'm back in the workshop painting. This time, I'm using Phoenix Precision Paints version of LMS Crimson Lake. And I do hope that you can see that this is an entirely different colour. The problem was, I bought this paint originally for my large model Showman's engine, and the good thing is I have plenty of it left for my small Showman's engine. Try not to get too excited, this is another shot of the paint drying. This time it's Phoenix Precision Paints and it's a different colour. I'm going to compare the colour of the traction engine with the colour of the paint I've just sprayed on the flywheel. Here it is being compared against the HMG version of LMS Crimson Lake. I'll repeat the sequence a couple of times so you can take it all in. I really don't think that the HMG Crimson Lake that I received is the same colour Crimson Lake that's on the engine. Time now for another comparison after I painted the flywheel using the Phoenix Precision Paints version of LMS Crimson Lake. It's difficult to tell because the paint on the flywheel is still wet, but it looks nearer to the paint on the engine than the other one did. What I'm doing in this clip is removing the oil tank, because I need to get to the check valve that is conveniently or inconveniently right behind the oil tank, so I can't get at it with this in the way. When I undid the 2 bolts holding the oil tank to the belly tank, I still couldn't get at the check valve. Note to self, bring some nut spinners down from the main workshop to my second workshop. The oil tank was still in the way, held in place by the linkage, so with a spanner behind on the nut and a bit of help from my small Barco spanner, I removed the linkage. This allowed me to loosen the union nut on the water pump. And once again in my second workshop, which is built onto the house, I didn't have the right size spanner, so very carefully, as always, I'm using my Barco spanner. The next thing to do was to rotate the steering wheel. With the front wheel out of the way, I could move the oil tank into a position where that too was out of the way. Now removing the check valve should be simple. Barco at the ready, I removed the second union nut. Obviously the paint's going to come off these union nuts, but I want it to anyway. While I'm looking at this, I can see quite a lot of the paintwork's been touched in the past by somebody who was obviously colourblind. Before I put these parts back together, I think I will touch in the paint with the correct colour, or at least somewhere near the correct colour. Here I'm showing how once again I'm using my Barco spanner with a screwdriver through the hole in the handle to start the loosening procedure of the check valve in the boiler bush. Before I put these check valves back in place, I'm going to clean up the paintwork in this area because it's not good at all. In fact, the touch-up paint on the boiler barrel looks more like Great Northern Railway's chocolate brown. I'll sort this out in due course. I need to remove the paint from both of the check valves and this piece of pipe extension. You can see that it wasn't too difficult to remove this check valve, but it wasn't as easy as at the other side. The next job is to put some standard cellulose thinners in my food container. Then I put the parts into the cellulose thinners, but unfortunately it's not deep enough. In this clip I'm refitting the lid to the food container, and just for the record, it's not airtight, watertight or cellulose thinners tight. Also, I forgot to put the other check valve into the food container. It must be the fumes. I'll do this off camera, and the next time you see the piping and the check valves, they should all be completely devoid of paint. And that is it for this episode. Stay safe, stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.